So the Bundesliga returns today. Last weekend we had the traditional season opener, the Super Cup, which was won by Bayern Munich, while the DFB Pokal also kicked off. So this week is the most unoriginal idea of who will finish where this season. To keep you entertained, this will be done in reverse order. So to start with, 18th, who will finish last? And the answer is Heidenheim. They obviously came very close, and I mean very close, to getting relegated last season. And if it wasn't for Leo Ciencia and a late win against Elversberg, they would be in the Zweite Bundesliga at the moment. Obviously last season, European football didn't help them, and it affected their form as they were rotating on two fronts, which they clearly weren't built for, especially because they had lost Tim Kleindienst and Jan Nicholas Bester going into this season. But then looking at the business they've done this summer, they haven't done anything major to improve the team. I mean, one of their best players from last season, Paul Vanner, they've lost. He returned to Bayern Munich. They obviously lost Franz Kretzig, who also returned to Bayern Munich before moving to Salzburg. And it could potentially get worse because Leo Ciencia has been linked with a move away, and he's also one of their better players. And so if he does move, then I think there's little hope for Heidenheim, and it would look like their time in the Bundesliga is now over. So in 17th, I've gone for St. Pauli. They ended last season quite poorly. Obviously, they were quite a pragmatic side last season and impressed to a degree under Alexander Blessin. Luckily, they kept Blessin, despite the fact he was linked with a move to Leipzig for most of the summer. But that drop in form allowed them to drift towards the relegation zone. And then the losses of Joshua Guidevogi and Elias Saad this summer won't help them in their fight for survival. And obviously the Pokal has started, and what wouldn't help morale is the fact that they struggled and needed penalties to beat a 4th division side in the first round, and it could have resulted them getting knocked out in their own stadium but away from home, and that's obviously quite embarrassing. And I think, and you see this logic for the next team as well, is the fact that the two teams that were worse than them last season have been relegated, and I think the two teams coming up are a lot better and so should be able to hold their own this season. So for the bottom dwellers last season, this doesn't bode well. Admittedly, I would like to see St. Pauli actually stay in the league, and I would prefer to say Hoffenheim in this position, but sadly they look like they're a competent team this season. So in 16th, and so this would be the relegation playoff position, I've gone for Union Berlin. Union have been floating around the relegation zone for a while now. Obviously in 23-24 they had rescued themselves on the final day. Last season it was a lot more comfortable. Obviously Stefan Baumgart came in and steadied the ship, and they became a very strong defensive side. But usually the novelty with Baumgart wears off. On top of this, they do have one of the worst attacks in the league, and the departure of their top goal scorer Benedikt Hollerbach will be a big loss. But in return, they've brought in Oliver Burke from Werder Bremen and Ilias Ansah from Paderborn. So they may be able to provide the cover needed to somewhat survive. But I feel like Union have been clutching at straws for quite a while now, and this may be the reality check they need, which is what the relegation playoff normally gives. Now, the first of the promoted sides, it's Hamburg. I think obviously Hamburg finished second, and so kind of objectively they are technically the worst of the two, but I think they have recruited well. I think the fact that they are Hamburg has helped them, and I expect them to not go down straight away. They've brought in Yusuf Poulsen, who brings much needed Bundesliga experience. Jordan Tu Noriga is an upgrade in their defence, and Ryan Philippe, who they brought from Eintracht Braunschweig, is an interesting signing. Their only downside is the fact that they've lost Ludovic Reis, who has been a key part of Hamburg. For most of their spell in the Zweite Bundesliga, he moved to Club Brugge, and they are now heavily lacking in central midfield, which should be an area they should really address. It will be interesting to see how the inexperienced Merlin Poulsen can handle the Bundesliga. I mean, when he was appointed Hamburg manager earlier this season, this was his first job. And so going from the Zweite Bundesliga to the Bundesliga is a completely different kettle of fish. Obviously, though, ahead of him there is Stefan Kuntz, who has experience not only as a player in the Bundesliga, but a manager at a high level. So he should be able to help Poulsen if there are any teething problems. My logic for Hamburg finishing 15th is they're one of the biggest teams in Germany. So I really expect them to kind of aura farm their way to survival. I think the fact that they are Hamburg will help them a lot. And also the fact that the emotion they'll be riding heading into the new year, into this season, will help them a lot. Obviously the highlights for Hamburg come quite quickly. I mean, they played Borussia Mönchengladbach on the opening day, the team that they played last when they got relegated. Then the next game they play St. Pauli, so you've got the Hamburg derby immediately. And then immediately after that, you have Hamburg against Bayern Munich, the game that most people have been waiting for because it's a clash that historically is very big in Germany, especially going back to the 80s. In 14th is Werder Bremen. So Bremen, I think the hiring of Horst Steffen is obviously an interesting one. His work that he's done at Elversberg speaks for itself. However, the squad is a mess and it's overcrowded in certain places and sparse in others. And what hasn't helped them is their convincing loss to Arminia Bielefeld in the DFB Pokal at the weekend. So the morale going into the season so far is quite low. They've already lost experienced players in Martin Zetterer, Marvin Duksch, Anthony Jung, who have all left. And the squad has gotten significantly younger. However, this experience may work against Bremen as they still adjust to life under Horst Steffen. So Bremen are clearly a team in transition under Werner. And so far it's happened very poorly. And with very little rivals and them kicking off their season on Saturday, they are far from Bundesliga ready. And I think this is a trend that is becoming increasingly more obvious in German football. A lot of teams are going to try and adopt this model of trying to become this attractive football team who can buy and develop young players before selling them on. They want to be like what Borussia Dortmund once were, the same with what Frankfurt are now and Leipzig. They want to become that team. And you're seeing it with Werder Bremen, with the decision to hire a manager who exclusively has played young players. And you also see it with Augsburg as well, which we'll get to later, with the fact that they hired Sandro Wagner. And obviously the problem with this is loads of teams want to be like this now. And it gets to a point where it becomes so saturated, what's the point? And I think Bremen's experiment so far looks like it's going to fail quite drastically, and they'll probably end up hiring a known firefighter potentially come the new year, whether that's Bruno Labbadia or going in the direction of Urs Fischer. The other promoted team is Cologne, and I have them to finish in 13th. They have hired Lukas Kwasniok, who nearly led Paderborn to promotion. And like Steffen, who I just mentioned, he does play attractive football. And why are Cologne so high up? Well, the spine of the squad is very similar to the one that got relegated just over a year ago. Their transfer ban meant they were allowed to give opportunities to young players, give them experience. However, the majority of them have now left the club. You have Tim Lemperle, a known day drinker and party boat lover, has moved to Hoffenheim on a free transfer. Max Vingrafer has moved to Leipzig, and Damien Downs has also moved to Southampton. And these were players that were all played an important role for Cologne in their fight for promotion. And so this has meant most of their business has been replacing players. So they've brought in experience in the likes of Marius Bülter from Hoffenheim and Robert Zieler from Hanover, but they've also invested in exciting players such as Isak Johannesson from Fortuna Düsseldorf, Rav van den Berg, the brother of former Liverpool and Mainz centre-back Sepp, and Ragnar Ache, a proven striker from the Zweite Bundesliga. So I think this group of new players along with this experience at this level they already have, mean they have quite a good position to finish in 13th. And I think compared to the teams around them as well, they're significantly better. And yeah, it will not be difficult for them to be relegated. So now what you'll notice, what I will say is from 12th until 9th, I would say these teams are pretty interchangeable. I think they are in the category of too good to be relegated, not good enough to challenge for Europe. And I think Augsburg are one of them. Last year they were defensively very sound under Jens Thorpe, but they sacked him and replaced him with Wagner. Obviously this is Wagner's first major coaching role in the Bundesliga. He's obviously managed Germany as an assistant and also Unterhaching, where he did actually impress. And so most of the eyeballs on Augsburg will be on how Sanjo Wagner does. When it comes to the players, the squad isn't much different, or in fact better compared to last season. But I think they are good enough to survive and not get sucked into a relegation battle. But what I will say is Finn Darman for England. Now in 11th is Wolfsburg. They are another team who have named a new head coach in Paul Simonis, who joins from Go Ahead Eagles in the Netherlands. There he helped them win their first title in over 100 years and now has the challenge of making Wolfsburg an interesting team to watch, which is significantly harder. Wolfsburg's most interesting signings are Vinny Souza from Sheffield United and the return of Jesper Lindström to the Bundesliga. So if Wolfsburg want to become relevant again, then Simonis will need to get the best out of Mohamed Amoura and Lovro Mayer. Mayer showed flashes in the DFB Pokal game at the weekend. 10th, Hoffenheim. As mentioned, they've spent their way out of last season, as they usually do. And they've refreshed the squad, which they did kind of need to do as well, which obviously one can do when you just get given 80 million from your sugar daddy. Obviously the main departures this summer have been Anton Stack, who joined Leeds United, and Tom Bischoff, who joined Bayern Munich. They've automatically been replaced by Leon Abdullah from Basel and Wout Berger, who will replace that pair. And then in defence, they've signed Koki Mashida from Union Saint-Gilloise and Bernardo, who should really refresh their defence. However, actually, with Hoffenheim, it's not just the players they've brought in, it's the players that have returned as well. Admittedly, they do have a good crop of young youth players. Mohamed Damar and Fiznik Aslani returned from Elversberg, where they impressed and obviously helped them challenge for promotion, and so they want to prove themselves now in the Bundesliga with Hoffenheim. Damar can obviously act as a long-term replacement for Andrej Kramaric, while Fiznik Aslani can play alongside Max Morstead, along with new signing Tim Lemperle and Bazumana Traore. And then obviously on top of this also means there are no more excuses for Christian Ilse. He's had a full pre-season and has been significantly backed financially, as most managers at Hoffenheim are. So if they struggle once again, he shouldn't last long. And if they are anywhere close to last season, he could potentially be the first manager sacked. So with Mainz, I expect them to drop off this season. The loss of Jonathan Burkhardt, as well as juggling the Conference League, will most likely be detrimental to them. Obviously, their only major signing so far has been Benedikt Hollerbach. Does he really improve the squad? That's the question. I don't think he does. So the main players to keep an eye on are the homegrown players. Now, when I wrote this, Nelson Viper was one of them. He impressed at the Under-21 Euros and should carry this form into the season. However, his future at Mainz now looks in doubt, which I think is a shame. But if he went to somewhere like Stuttgart, obviously the situation will probably change quite significantly. But then the other homegrown talent is Paul Nabel. He, in his first season in the Bundesliga, he did impress and was a key part for Mainz's march to the Conference League. And so I think it'd be interesting to see the development that he potentially takes. And so I think despite not being picked apart, I don't really think Mainz will be able to sustain the level that they did last season. But obviously a top half finish is still impressive for them. So in 8th, it's Borussia Mönchengladbach. Now, if you're eagle-eyed, you may accuse me of bias. But the great thing about Gladbach is they could very well qualify for Europe, while at the same time have the ability to fight relegation. The question for Gladbach is how good can they be without the injured Tim Kleindienst and the departed Ko Itakura and Alisson Player? The signings of Shuto Machino, Jens Kastrup and Kevin Dix are promising. But at the end of the day, this all comes down to Gerardo Seoane. And since being appointed, he hasn't shown an ability to improve the team at all and get the best out of them. The departure of Player means Seoane now has to find a way to get the best out of Kevin Stöger to fill the creative gap left. Obviously, Frank Honorat can also play there, the same as Shuto Machino, but Kevin Stöger has shown his ability at this level beforehand. And it's clearly Seoane's problem that he's not able to get the best out of him. Because in an ideal world, a front four of Honorat, Stöger, Hack and Kleindienst should be good enough to at least challenge for the latter European places. I also do think the season is do or die for Seoane. If he fails and there's no improvement, he has to be sacked because it can't go on like this. So in 7th, I have Freiburg. They're obviously the best of the rest now. They've obviously made some very interesting acquisitions over the summer. The loss of Ritsu Doan will be felt, but the arrivals of Iri, Yuito Suzuki, as well as Derry Sherhand should fill the gap left, while Yohan Manzambi should play a bigger role this season, and he's definitely a younger player to watch. On top of this, the Breisgau Brazilians also have to contend with the Europa League, and no Champions League sides are dropping down now with this new league format. So they do actually have a very good chance that they could progress quite far in the competition. And so this could present them with a good opportunity, which could actually also affect their league form. And obviously what will also be interesting is that of head coach Julian Schuster. This will be his second season in charge, and he'll have to make sure he doesn't suffer from second season syndrome and can take this team further and take them onwards and upwards, because it's a team with potential to be quite a good one. In 6th is Eintracht Frankfurt. Frankfurt will obviously have to juggle with the Champions League as well as the Bundesliga, which could most likely will affect their form in some degree. On top of the fact they have lost their two best players in the past two windows. Obviously this is Frankfurt, they've been able to replace them with somewhat ease. The signings they've made so far are Jonathan Burkhardt and Ritsu Doan. Obviously the question mark is, will this be enough to replace Ekitike? Frankfurt will probably have an ace up their sleeve and a player to replace Ekitike that we haven't heard of yet, but as things stand, it's those question marks. The squad is obviously big enough and okay enough to compete on three fronts, but whether they have a quality to maintain the challenge over the same three fronts is yet to be seen. Obviously the season presents the opportunity for Can Uzun to step up. We saw his flashes last season. Now is the time to make one of those positions behind the striker zone, while Eddie Awahi has to improve on his performances. I'm pretty certain he didn't score a goal last season. That needs to change. Obviously what helps is there is some sort of Bundesliga experience behind him in Michy Batshuayi. In 5th is RB Leipzig. Leipzig also have a new head coach, and I think this really makes them a team of unknowns. Ole Werner is not exactly the type of head coach that gives young players a chance. So being in charge of an institution that likes to give young players a chance seems counterintuitive. Obviously they've invested heavily in their attack, and all of their incomings are interesting in their own degree. Johan Bakayoko is experienced at a high level. Jan Diamande, they pay quite a hefty fee for someone from Leganes. Andrei Maksimovic joins from Red Star Belgrade. And then you've got new striker Romulo, who joins from Göztepe in Turkey. He's obviously an interesting striker because he will be the replacement for Benjamin Sesko. Then in midfield, they've signed Ezekiel Bazouzi from Leuven, and then they've also signed Arthur Vermeeren permanently. This sets Leipzig up quite well. On paper, they have a very strong team. Obviously, the strength of this team could become even stronger if Xabi Simons stays. Obviously, their biggest departure so far has been Sesko. And I think if Simons stays, they could potentially push even further up, as the burden of the attack will not be as great on him anymore, as you have all these other players and options now who are still good enough. And I'm even forgetting names like Lois Openda and Antonio Nusa, who are still there. And so I think what makes Leipzig the unknown is Ole Werner. He's a manager, as we've seen with Bremen, who trusts the more experienced players. So do you really want to be playing Kevin Campbell over Banzuzi? At the weekend, Leipzig played in the DFB Pokal against Sandhausen, and although it was hairy for a minute, they did manage to recover, and so should have and Simons did play. So it's clearly shown that he's not been frozen out yet. So in fourth, Stuttgart. Obviously they won the Pokal last season, but had a bit of an off-season in the league. They haven't done as much business as you would expect, but do they really need to? I mean, their squad's already good enough. I mean, most of the players who've signed are young players. Thiago Thomas is the only one who may have a starting role. This season, I do expect Stuttgart to kick on and find their true level and be one of the big teams and best teams in Germany. I think Stuttgart's performance against Bayern in the Super Cup showed that they've closed the gap on them. But something is still missing to close the gap further. Obviously, they were too wasteful in possession and Bayern were too easy on the ball. Or they were too easy on Bayern in defence. But what I am excited about for Stuttgart is the Europa League. I think on their day, they have the capability to win the competition as a whole. And I think with the experience of winning the Pokal as well as their poor experiences in Europe of the Champions League, they should give them the experience they need to challenge in the Europa League. And so I expect and I think Stuttgart should go far in this competition, potentially even winning it as well. So as I pointed out in my last video, Leverkusen on paper are good enough to finish in the top 4. Despite losing key players, they still have a very good starting 11 at their disposal, and Ten Hag is clearly a good enough manager to lead them. Obviously, Schick is one of the best strikers in the league. Edmund Tapsoba and Piero Hincapié should be given bigger roles in defence, and then Ezekiel Palacios and Alex Garcia should also be given bigger roles in midfield. Obviously, they will drop off in quality compared to last season, and I do think they will be a lot closer to 6th than they will be to 1st, but they are still a good enough team to make it into the Champions League. Again, in an earlier video, I outlined my reasonings about why Dortmund will be able to challenge Bayern, but I do have them in 2nd place. Kovac has clearly installed a mentality in the squad that wasn't there beforehand. They also possess one of the best strikers in Guirassy and one of the best goalkeepers in the league in Gregor Kobel. However, they do tend to be too reliant on them. Dortmund is still not a finished product of a squad. They still need to invest in the transfer market correctly. If they sign in a centre-back, which they quite obviously need, as well as more midfielders, and they improve around the role players of what is a strong core, then they have a good job of coming close to Bayern. I think obviously the most key thing is they make sure they don't forget that they are Dortmund. Now in 1st, it's obviously Bayern Munich. I think the only reason Bayern will win the league is that no one has done anything outstanding to close the gap on them. In fact, they themselves haven't really gotten any better over the summer. I think Jonathan Tah and Luis Diaz are not game-changing signings, and are barely upgrades on the players that they were replacing, whether that was Leroy Sané or Min-Jae Kim. I think for Bayern, what will be interesting is Vincent Kompany. I think it'd be whether he suffers from second season syndrome, similar to what Alonso suffered last season. You'd probably be like, oh, this isn't Alonso's second season. It was his second full season. And I think if he does suffer, and Bayern fail to win the league convincingly, and crash out of the Pokal and Champions League, then Kompany could be sacked. And I think the other scenario is that Pep Guardiola leaves City as a coach, and Company is then hired to replace him because it will be his homecoming, and from a CV perspective, he's then shown his style of play can transition to the high level. From a personnel perspective, I think for Bayern, the main question will be how do they handle the absence of Jamal Musiala until most likely the second half of the season. Obviously, they do have a bunch of young players coming in, Leonard Carl, for example, and whether they give Paul Vanner a chance is unknown at the moment. But this is a very small squad, and whether they can maintain a three-front challenge is unknown, and something may have to sacrifice come the latter part of the season, because as things stand, Bayern will not be able to compete when it comes to the business end of the Bundesliga and the business end of the Champions League, especially when the quality of teams, especially in the Premier League, is quite a lot better than Bayern Munich. So yeah, that is my prediction for the upcoming Bundesliga season. Obviously, come May, I could be completely wrong, which usually happens. Obviously, I would like to be optimistic about this season. However, I do think it's hard to see any team not Bayern winning unless specific circumstances happen. So yeah, let me know what you think below.
You lot subscribe to the channel. Obviously, I'm saying this sort of free will. No one's forcing me. There's a lot of good content on there, so subscribe to the channel.